Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L and we're finally here. My final thoughts on Kado, the right answer. These are my thoughts on where Kado ended up and what I felt was the major turning point in Kado for a lot of viewers. So just to let you guys know, I know that there's a few of you that really enjoy Kado and wanted my opinion on it, and this video is pretty much for you guys. But Kado really was a really interesting situation in terms of this wasn't so much an anime that was overly exciting as more of it was a more thought-provoking kind of experience. And so when you have that kind of thought-provoking experience, it's pretty easy to screw it up, at least compared to what it initially started off as. So it's easy to screw it up in the sense that, you come in with this expectation and then when something happens and it goes a different direction, people might have been slightly disappointed. People were saying that this was kind of ruining the show for them once the turning point happened. But I wanted to premise and say, I guess, first before getting into this, is that where Kado ultimately ended up, when it first started, it started off as a story where it was, what would people do if they were approached by a benevolent, altruistic, godlike being? How would people adapt? How would people go around dealing with the innovations that this godlike being would be producing? And it brought up really interesting things like, hey, you don't have to sleep anymore, or hey, let's just give everyone in the world the ability to have any energy, or just have all the energy they need. All they need to do is know how to make it. Let's give these people power and just let them live life. And how the characters went around negotiating and kind of getting those conclusions to happen, to get those kind of scenarios going down. It was the most interesting part of the show. Ultimately, what we got at the end, however, after the turning point, was pretty much, it turned into, let's watch a godlike figure become human and then struggle with the human problems. And to its credit, it was still a pretty engaging thing. And this is the important part. When I was sitting down to make this video and I watched the final episode, it really kind of changed the tone for this dialogue right now. It really changed the tone because I think the ending for Kado is still really respectable, because it just changed the argument altogether. It changed what the ultimate focus was in the span of 3 episodes. Now, overall as a series, is that a good thing? It really depends, because Kado was such a thought-provoking series in general that any kind of intellectual deviation and going into just another intellectual territory, it won't seem as bad as, say, if it was a shonen. So ultimately with Kado, we ended up in a situation where it was seeing this godlike being have these really human expressions, have these really human thoughts, have this really human conflict, and ultimately how we dealt with him, it was pretty much seeing hubris fall. It was seeing just everything collapse around this godlike being that was Zashuina. And I say godlike being, but we know his people pretty much responsible for creating the universe, as we find out in the final episode. Or not final episode, as you find out in episode 9, the turning point episode. So I've been saying turning point a lot, and that's because there was something that happened in that episode that was just so exciting. It was just so fun it was something I was just very excited to get into, because there was just such a level of irony present in one bit of dialogue that was just excellent. And that's pretty much the main focus of this video. So just before we get into the actual meat of the video, I just want to premise, the ending of Kado, I feel, is still respectable. It just tackled a different problem. It just made the story a little bit more digestible for the average viewer. Actually, yeah, that's what that ending really did. It made an ending that is understandable for most people. It made an ending that's understandable for the vast majority of people by giving us a clear-cut villain, a clear-cut hero, and I guess a pretty unique solution. Anyway, the turning point. Let's get, what was it that changed where Kado was going on a fundamental level in episode 9? Now, I'm just going to tell you flat out, it wasn't Saraka going and just, I guess, nuking an entire hole in the actual Kado device and revealing that she was actually one of these isotropic beings, where the only foreshadowing that we got was from the opening sequence. It wasn't that. It wasn't the moment that Zashawina just declared that he was going to kill the current Shindo and just go and restart the whole process or restart his conversation. It wasn't either of those two moments, but those two moments were moments that were really important in just establishing like how off the rails Kado was about to go. No, the moment that really set this apart, that changed the entire thing that this show was about, was the moment that Zashawina went and said, "We want information," and specifically followed it up with, "We want to bathe in more information than we could ever process." Now that statement becomes really important because we have those two big events that happen right afterwards, the death or the attempted murder of Shindo, and then Saraka going in and just revealing she's an alien. Those two moments aren't that important. They just set up a premise, because after that, everything that happens in the subsequent episodes is all coming back to what this one statement established. And now what you might be asking, like, what is it that this statement established? Well, it's pretty simple. Remember, Kado at its, I guess, core, what problem was it ultimately tackling when it came to the humans? What concepts did their problem revolve around? And when you boil it down and you look at the arguments that were presented very early on in Kado, what it ultimately revolved around was needs, wants, and the lack of resource. Those were the three things that, if you were to just boil down the main problems that Zashawina highlighted in humanity, it would come down to those three concepts: need, want, and lack of resource or supply, however you want to phrase it. And the inventions or the devices that Zashawina provided for humanity ultimately revolved around that concept. With the WAM, we had infinite energy. Energy was no longer a problem. If people wanted energy, they had it. They did not have to pay for it. It was free energy. They were set. All they had to know was how to make it. With the Sansa, he also provided something in terms of resource. He gave humans the opportunity to not have to waste time sleeping. Like, if you wanted to sleep, yeah, you could. But ultimately, what he gave them with the Sansa was the resource of time. Now humans could just work all the time and be efficient. When you look at what he was ultimately giving, it was tools to give them more resources to satisfy their needs and their wants, to kind of deal with that balance. So when you go back to his initial statement about we want to bathe in more information that we could ever process, what ultimately happens when you look at that statement and you consider what was going on with the human side is that this is an identical situation to what the humans were experiencing. There's this concept in Hermetic philosophy, the law of correspondence or something along those lines, pretty much saying that what appears on the micro scale is also what appears on the macro scale. And when it comes to spirituality and just generally talking about humans in comparison to godlike figures, it lends really well. In this case, we have that issue happening here. The anisotropic beings and the humans are ultimately both facing the same fundamental problems revolving around need, want, and lack of supply. And so when you have Zashawina saying that, what it ultimately does is that it humanizes Zashawina to such a point that he is comparable to a human. His problems have just now become humanized. The only difference between the anisotropic beings and humans at this point is that humans value energy, for instance, while Zashawina and his kind value information. All that's changed is what is actually in scarcity. All of a sudden, these guys ultimately, they're dealing with the same issue of wants, needs, and lack of supply. And that ultimately permeates to the final episode, where Zashawina is now acting way more human. Look at his facial expression. This is actually something really good on Toei, even in the moment where he is saying that he wants to bathe in that information thing. His face is twitching a little bit more. His eyes are a little bit more desperate. His mannerisms are a bit more human. He's not this mysterious guy anymore. It's just we understand it. He wants something out of us. We understand that on a fundamental level. And the thing is, this scene was very important because for a lot of viewers, you could very easily go back and retroactively just reduce everything that Zashawina did. And this is probably like the worst thing out of all of this that could have happened from this sequence. Because you have this character who we now know is not altruistic, everything that he said before stands to lose value depending on what the viewer kind of prioritizes, whether it be trust or whether it be the logical sequence of events, which I personally think isn't really fair. The things that Zashawina was presenting in the first half of the show are still very useful, but now because malicious intent is associated behind them, it makes it easier for people to just jump and say that this was a bad guy. Because malicious intent is easier to understand than altruism from coming from a higher being. Just because malicious intent is something we're much more familiar with in general. And that's also something that's reflected in the show when we're seeing humanity's early reactions to the anisotropic. They're all talking about how they're going to swindle each other out of it. We see the countries trying to take Japan down because they have this resource. You know, malicious intent. It's something very understandable, and it was one of the things that was highlighted in Kado. The moment Zashawina said this, it also did something for another character. The moment that he had malicious intent applied to his character, you know, it was easier for people to see this guy is bad. The concept of Zashawina is bad becomes a lot easier to swallow, and it made another character stand out. It made Saraka's point of view stand out. Because at this point, and this isn't exactly something that maybe the fans reacted to, because Saraka was a big issue when it first happened. But what the creators ultimately tried to do here in terms of the narrative is that they paint Zashawina as a slightly more antagonistic figure, and that is supposed to give Saraka's point of view more weight. Because Saraka's point of view was effectively something along the lines of, you know, let's just keep being humans. Let's just keep going our way. Let's just keep doing things how we want to do it. And guys, just think about it. Had Saraka never have been one of these beings, and had Zashawina not uttered those statements and not have acted in a human desire, would Saraka's point have been more valid? If everything was on the up and up, would Saraka's point still be something that's anti-progress? Because for me, whenever I heard Saraka's point, I just thought she was being kind of ignorant. And if she had been just a human, it would have been just ignorant. But because Saraka was this particular plot point, and because Zashawina was revealed to have malicious intention, it became easier to accept that Saraka's point of view was the slightly more correct point of view. But that was more not because of the strength of Saraka's arguments, because her arguments, I don't think, were that strong. It was more because the alternative was now literally risking humans being destroyed. Now, this is really the only bad thing that we really got shorted with when it came to moving in this different direction of a more humanized being in Zashawina. The real thing is, like, just wonder what would have happened if we had maintained Zashawina as a generally neutral being who only had humanity's best interests at heart. If he were just going to be like, guys, I'll leave you all my tools and then I'll just kind of head off and you guys do whatever you want with it. Or I can just stay and watch and we see how the world will interact. Had that remained the narrative, think about what the final moments could have been for Kado. What if Zashawina still wanted to kind of take people into anisotropic, but maybe he wasn't as aggressive? What if he was just more of a, hey, Shindo, I kind of want to take you to anisotropic. Let's talk this out. If Shindo was to decline and say, no, I think we should go back to a more humanistic approach here, would the final episode have been just a massive debate between two characters trying to argue out the point of staying human or accepting advancement at any possible turn? How would they have structured that kind of narrative? And that's the problem right there. For anime and just for people in general, can you imagine how you can try and make an argument or make an argument between a god who clearly knows more and a human who wants to remain ignorant? How would you make that argument flow? There's just no easy way to come up with that argument. And if the writers had been able to pull it off, it would have been something that either would have been full of a lot of holes, or it would have been something that would have been like, wow, that was actually very thought-provoking. At that point, you really need, I guess, philosophy majors. You need a philosopher to kind of try and explain those kind of points, because that's effectively making an argument of what do you do if God asks you why you don't want to be a god. You know, it's that kind of argument. So I understand to some degree that narrative would have been very hard to pull off, and it wouldn't be very climactic. It wouldn't kind of fall into the general anime story, and that would have been a bit troubling. But the story of humans rising up against a godlike being and trying to kind of win with Kado's own unique twist, because they still try and go for a twist using Shindo's character in the finale, but the story of a god and a human ultimately clashing, and clashing not with words, clashing with action, as we see in the finale. That's much easier to write. That's much easier to understand. That's much easier to make as a finale. So it was unfortunate. It was unfortunate in that degree, because Kado had been an intellectual show up to episode 9, and had it continued being an intellectual show, and had Force not been introduced to try and coerce Shindo into going into the anisotropic, we could have been seeing a very interesting kind of debate. But again, that debate would have been very hard to kind of even structure. I can't even imagine how they would have started. What schools of philosophy would those writers have had to go through? What religions would they have had to source? What mentality would they have ultimately have picked for Zashuina to model how an ideal being would be? Would they pick Shinto? Would they refer to Buddhism? Would they refer to esotericism in general? Hermetics? What would they have used to model a god's behavior, an altruistic god's behavior? It's tough. You write what you know. You can model a god wanting more, though. That's relatively easy to model, and we see it in the finale. He's ultimately acting like a human. He feels sad when Shindo goes down. He recognizes the value of a soul. He wants more, and he ultimately pleads with Shindo at the end to please, just like, do you want to just come with me? And ultimately they resort to violence, the most human thing that you could do when you're having a disagreement. So, you know, it all comes from that one moment. It all comes from that humanizing statement. The events that happened afterward are just there to set up the premise that he was that desperate. But it all originates from the very simple statement that they wanted more information. The same way that humans want, so did the gods. So that's pretty much my thoughts on Kado. Guys, this was a bigger video than I expected. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have anything to say down below, you know, let me know. And guys, for the ones that were waiting for this video, I hope this was worth it. I have a lot of fun talking about these topics, and I just hope you guys enjoyed listening to it. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. And until next time, I hope you have the best day possible. And ultimately, Kado, I loved you. You were worth it.